The road stretched ahead of Daniel like a winding snake, slithering through the dense forest that lined both sides. His car's headlights pierced through the darkness, illuminating only a small patch of the cracked asphalt and the trees standing like silent sentinels. The GPS signal had cut out miles ago, leaving him to rely on old signs and faded memories of this once familiar route. The air inside the car was heavy, a blend of stale cigarette smoke and the faint metallic tang of anxiety. The dashboard clock glowed with an eerie green light. 11:13 p.m. He'd been driving for hours, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud of tires hitting small potholes. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest the moment he crossed the county line. He hadn't been back in nearly a decade, not since his parents passed away. The house had stood vacant ever since, a decaying monument to a life he'd tried to forget. But now, the call from the lawyer had forced his hand. The property needed to be sold, and he had to sign the papers in person. As he turned down a narrow gravel road, the forest seemed to close in tighter around him. The branches above intertwined, forming a skeletal canopy that blocked out the stars. A sudden chill crept into the car, making him shiver despite the heater's warm air. He glanced at his phone one last time. No signal. The gravel crunched under the tires as the house finally came into view. It loomed at the end of the road, a two-story structure with peeling paint and shattered windows. The porch sagged under the weight of years, and the front door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. The sight sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. He parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the house. Memories flooded back. Summer afternoons spent playing in the yard, winter nights huddled by the fireplace. But those were distant echoes, overshadowed by the more recent memories of his parents' illness, their voices reduced to whispers, and the oppressive silence that followed. Taking a deep breath, Daniel grabbed his duffel bag from the passenger seat and stepped out into the night. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and something else, something metallic and sharp. He frowned but dismissed it, attributing it to the old pipes or rusting metal around the property. The wooden steps groaned under his weight as he climbed onto the porch. He pushed the door open, its hinges letting out a long, mournful creak. Inside, the air was colder, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface. The living room was just as he remembered it, though time had not been kind. The old couch sagged in the middle, and the wallpaper peeled away in long strips, revealing the faded plaster beneath. As he set his bag down, the house seemed to sigh, as if exhaling after years of holding its breath. The sound made him pause, but he shook his head and turned on his flashlight. The beams swept across the room, illuminating the worn furniture and the shadows that clung to the corners like cobwebs. A sudden noise made him freeze, a soft, skittering sound coming from upstairs. It could be rats or some other animal that had taken up residence, he reasoned. Still, the thought of venturing upstairs in the dark made his skin crawl. He decided to check it out later, after securing the main floor. The kitchen was worse than the living room. The linoleum floor was cracked and curling at the edges, and the cabinets hung open, their contents long since scavenged by rodents. The refrigerator door was ajar, revealing a cavernous interior filled with nothing but shadows. Daniel's stomach churned as he closed the fridge and leaned against the counter. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall. It shouldn't have been ticking. There was no power. He stared at it, the hands moving steadily, counting down to something he couldn't yet comprehend. He left the kitchen and headed down the hallway toward the stairs. The door to the basement caught his eye, and a sense of unease washed over him. He remembered that door well. It had always been locked when he was a child, forbidden territory. His father's workshop, he'd been told, but now it stood slightly open, revealing a darkness deeper than the night outside. A cold draft wafted up from the basement, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odor. He wrinkled his nose and stepped back, deciding to leave that exploration for another time. Instead, he focused on the staircase, its wooden steps worn smooth by years of use. Each step groaned under his weight, echoing through the empty house. When he reached the top, the hallway stretched before him, lined with closed doors. His old bedroom was at the far end, and he made his way toward it, the flashlight's beam slicing through the darkness. The door opened with a reluctant creak, revealing a room frozen in time. Posters of rock bands still adorned the walls, and his childhood desk sat in the corner, covered in dust. He ran a hand over the surface, leaving a trail through the grime. The bed was still made, the blankets neatly folded as if waiting for his return. He sat on the edge of the bed and sighed, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. But as he leaned back, a sound from the hallway made him sit up again. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like the whisper of a voice carried on the wind. Daniel, his heart skipped a beat. He shone the flashlight toward the doorway, but it revealed only an empty hall. Swallowing hard, he closed the door and locked it, telling himself it was just his imagination. The house was old, full of creaks and groans. There was nothing to be afraid of, but as he lay down, pulling the blanket up to his chin, the sense of being watched refused to leave him. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and stretching along the walls. And somewhere, in the distance, a door slammed shut. He didn't sleep that night. Daniel lay rigid on the dusty mattress, his ears attuned to every creak and groan of the house. The blanket felt like a thin, useless shield against the chill seeping into the room. His mind raced, replaying the faint whisper that had called his name. It had been so soft, so fleeting, that he almost convinced himself he imagined it. Almost. The clock on his phone glowed. 2:27 a.m. Still no signal. The battery icon flashed red. He'd forgotten to charge it during the drive. He sighed and placed it on the nightstand, staring at the cracked ceiling above. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. But beneath that, there was something else, something he couldn't quite place. A low, rhythmic thump, like footsteps. He sat up, his pulse quickening. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, somewhere below him. The house shifted and settled, but this was deliberate, measured. He strained to listen, holding his breath. The steps grew louder, echoing in the stairwell. Daniel gripped the flashlight tighter, its cold metal comforting in his sweaty palm. He debated whether to call out, but decided against it. There was no one here. There couldn't be. He locked the front door. Annie? The question lingered, gnawing at him. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on him like a suffocating weight. He counted the seconds, each one stretching longer than the last. Then, a loud bang echoed from downstairs, shaking the walls. Adrenaline surged through him as he jumped to his feet. The noise had come from the kitchen. He was sure of it. His mind raced with possibilities. An animal knocking something over, a door slamming shut due to the wind. But deep down, he knew neither explanation fit. Steeling himself, Daniel unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The air was colder here, carrying a faint, musty scent mixed with something metallic. The flashlight's beam danced along the walls, casting long shadows that flickered like specters. The stairs loomed ahead, descending into darkness. He took a deep breath and started down, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the silence. The living room was just as he'd left it, undisturbed and blanketed in dust. He swung the flashlight toward the kitchen doorway, his heart hammering in his chest. The door to the basement was wide open now, revealing the yawning blackness beyond. The air here was colder, and the sickly sweet odor was stronger. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. but something compelled him forward, a pull he couldn't explain. As he approached the door, the flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. He smacked it against his palm, cursing under his breath. The beam steadied, illuminating the top of the basement stairs. The wooden steps descended into the abyss, each one warped and splintered. "Hello." His voice sounded small, swallowed by the darkness. No response, just a faint hum of silence. He took a cautious step onto the first stair. It creaked under his weight, the sound reverberating through the narrow space. He descended slowly, the air growing colder with each step. The flashlight flickered again, and this time, it died completely. "Damn it," he muttered, fumbling with the buttons. The darkness was absolute now, pressing in from all sides. His breathing quickened, each exhale visible in the frigid air. Blindly, he felt for his phone, but the battery had long since died. A sound broke the silence, a soft, wet drip. It echoed from somewhere deep in the basement, rhythmic and relentless. Daniel froze, listening. The dripping grew louder, more insistent, like a heartbeat. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, unsure of what lay ahead. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in the distance, casting a dim, amber glow. It illuminated a small corner of the basement, revealing a rusted workbench and stacks of old crates. The light pulsed, like a candle flickering in the wind. Daniel took a step forward, the concrete floor cold beneath his feet. The dripping sound grew louder, leading him toward the light. As he approached, the source of the glow became clear. An old, oil lantern sat on the workbench, its flame dancing erratically. He picked it up, the metal handle icy against his skin. The light cast long shadows on the walls, revealing more of the basement. Rusted tools hung from hooks, and cobwebs draped over everything like ghostly shrouds. But what caught his attention was the far wall. A large, wooden door stood there, its surface marred with deep scratches. The door didn't belong. It was different from the rest of the basement, newer but weathered. Something about it felt wrong, out of place. The scratches were jagged, as if made by something desperate to get in or out. The dripping sound was louder here, coming from the other side. He pressed his ear to the door, the wood cold against his skin. The sound was steady, hypnotic. Without thinking, he reached for the handle. A sudden jolt of electricity shot through his arm, making him yelp and pull back. The lantern flickered violently, the flame threatening to extinguish. He stumbled back, heart racing. "Get a grip, Daniel," he whispered to himself. But the sense of dread was overwhelming now, suffocating. He backed away from the door, unwilling to touch it again. The lantern's light cast a shadow on the wall, and for a moment, it looked like someone else's, a taller, broader figure looming behind him. Panicking, he spun around, but the basement was empty. The lantern's flame steadied, casting a warm glow over the room. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. But as he turned to head back upstairs, he heard it again. "Daniel." The whisper was clearer now, unmistakable. It came from the door. The voice was soft, almost pleading. His legs felt like lead as he forced himself to move, climbing the stairs two at a time. The basement door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. He didn't stop running until he was back in his bedroom, locking the door and barricading it with a chair. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. He crawled under the blanket, clutching the lantern like a lifeline. The whispers continued, faint but persistent, echoing through the walls. Sleep was impossible, and as dawn's first light seeped through the window, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Something in this house was watching him, and it wanted him to stay. The first light of dawn painted the room in muted shades of gray, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. Daniel blinked at the ceiling, exhaustion pulling at every fiber of his body. He hadn't slept. Not really. His mind had raced through the long hours of the night, replaying every sound, every whisper. The faint glow of the oil lantern on the nightstand was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay. He sat up slowly, every muscle aching from tension. The chair he had wedged under the doorknob sat untouched, a flimsy barrier against whatever had haunted him. But the house was silent now, almost deceptively so. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint creak of the floorboards as the house settled. Daniel swung his legs over the side of the bed and rubbed his face. His phone, now dead, sat uselessly on the nightstand. He needed to find a way to charge it, but more importantly, he needed answers. The basement door, the strange scratches, and the whisper, none of it made sense. He grabbed the flashlight, praying it still worked. The beam flickered on, weak but functional. Satisfied, he opened the bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The house felt different in the daylight, less oppressive but no less eerie. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, illuminated by the weak sunlight filtering through the dirty windows. His first stop was the kitchen. The old clock on the wall still ticked, despite the lack of power. It was stuck at 3 a.m., the minute hand trembling slightly as he caught him. He frowned, running a finger over the glass. The clock had always been here, a relic from his parents' time, but he didn't remember it working without power. He shook his head and turned his attention to the cabinets. Most were empty, their contents long gone, but one drawer near the sink caught his eye. It was locked, a rusted padlock securing it shut. Daniel tugged at it, but the lock held firm. Frustrated, he moved on, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. The living room yielded nothing but more dust and decay. However, as he approached the front door, he noticed something strange, a faint, chalky symbol drawn on the wood, just above the lock. It was circular, with jagged lines radiating outward like a sunburst, but twisted and asymmetrical. Daniel knelt, tracing the symbol with his finger. The chalk felt gritty, and a faint, coppery scent lingered in the air. He didn't recognize it, but it felt ancient. He snapped a mental picture, wishing he had his phone to document it. Determined to explore further, Daniel turned his attention back to the basement. The mere thought of going down there again made his stomach twist, but he couldn't ignore it. Something down there held the key to whatever was happening. The door to the basement was closed, but not locked. He hesitated before gripping the handle, half expecting another jolt of electricity. When nothing happened, he pulled it open, revealing the stairs descending into darkness. The sickly sweet smell was stronger now, making him gag. He covered his mouth and nose with his sleeve and stepped down, each creak of the stairs echoing ominously. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the same cluttered space he'd seen last night. The lantern on the workbench was dark now, its glass blackened with soot. As he approached the door at the far end, the scratches stood out more vividly in the daylight. They were deep, gouged into the wood with a force that made his skin crawl. But something new caught his attention, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the other side. Heart pounding, he pressed his ear to the door. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too precise, more like fingers drumming against a hard surface. "Hello," he called out, his voice shaking. The tapping stopped. Daniel's breath hitched. He waited, listening, but the silence stretched on. Gritting his teeth, he tried the handle again. This time, it turned easily, the door swinging open with a low groan. The room beyond was small, more like a cell than a proper room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with strange objects. Jars filled with murky liquid, dried herbs hanging from hooks, and bundles of old, yellowed paper tied with twine. The air was colder here, biting through his thin jacket. In the center of the room stood a small, wooden table. On it lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded with age. Daniel approached cautiously, the flashlight illuminating the worn lettering etched into the cover. Property of Samuel Gray, his father's name. His hands trembled as he opened the journal. The pages were filled with tight, cramped handwriting, diagrams, and more of those strange symbols. Flipping through, he realized it wasn't just a journal. It was a ledger, a record of rituals and incantations. One entry, in particular, caught his eye. April 12th, 1995. The house is alive. I've sealed the door, but it won't hold forever. They want in. I can hear them at night, whispering, tapping. The ritual must be completed. If not, God help us all. Daniel's heart raced. The date was familiar, just weeks before his parents fell ill. He flipped through more pages, finding entries that detailed strange occurrences. Doors opening on their own, shadows moving in the corners of his father's vision, and whispers calling out in the night. A noise behind him made him freeze, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor. He spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping the room. Nothing. Then, from the far corner, a shadow moved. It wasn't subtle. It slid along the wall, distinct from the flickering shadows cast by the flashlight. It was tall, impossibly so, its form stretching and contorting as it approached. Daniel stumbled back, knocking over a jar that shattered on the floor. The noise seemed to agitate the shadow, which surged forward with unnatural speed. The temperature plummeted, and the flashlight flickered violently. Panicking, Daniel grabbed the journal and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind him. His chest heaved as he leaned against the wood, listening for any sign of pursuit. Silence. He didn't stop until he was back in his bedroom, the journal clutched tightly to his chest. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. The house wasn't just old. It was cursed, haunted by something malevolent. And his father had known. He flipped to the last entry in the journal. May 3rd, 1995. If you're reading this, it means I've failed. The house is theirs now. Leave while you still can. Do not return. Do not open the door. The word sent a chill down his spine. His father's warning was clear, but it was too late. The door had already been opened, and now Daniel was trapped. The house felt different now, more oppressive, as though it had woken up and was watching Daniel's every move. The journal lay open on the bed, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze from the cracked window. Daniel paced back and forth, the weight of his father's final warning heavy in his mind. Do not return. Do not open the door. But he had returned, and worse, he had opened it. The morning light had done little to chase away the darkness that seemed to cling to every corner of the house. Shadows shifted in ways they shouldn't, and the air was colder than it had any right to be. Daniel's breath hung in the air as he exhaled, a thin mist dissipating into the room. He knew he had to get out, but something about the house seemed intent on keeping him here. He glanced at his dead phone, cursing under his breath. Without a signal or power, contacting anyone was impossible. He needed to find a way to recharge it, but first he had to understand what he was dealing with. The journal was the only clue he had, and though its pages were cryptic, he hoped it held some answers. Daniel sat cross-legged on the bed, flipping through the journal once more. The symbols he had seen around the house, on the front door, carved into the basement walls, were all meticulously drawn and annotated within its pages. His father had clearly spent years studying them. Next to each symbol were notes in a mixture of English and Latin, along with diagrams of protective circles and talismans. One symbol stood out, the circular sunburst he had found near the front door. His father's notes described it as a binding sigil, meant to contain something powerful. The ink was smudged, but one word was clear. Malum, evil. The realization made Daniel's stomach knot. His father hadn't been trying to keep people out of the house. He had been trying to keep something in. A sudden thump broke Daniel's concentration. The sound was muffled but unmistakable, coming from the hallway just outside his bedroom. He froze, listening. Another thump followed, then a dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Daniel grabbed the flashlight, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the dim light seeping in from the windows. He cautiously approached the door, every instinct telling him to stay put. But he had to know. He opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The hallway stretched ahead, empty, but for a faint trail of dirt leading toward the stairs. The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic tapping. It was faint but steady, coming from downstairs. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped into the hallway, his footsteps eerily silent on the worn floorboards. The tapping grew louder as he descended the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. By the time he reached the ground floor, the sound had stopped. The living room was empty, just as it had been. The front door remained shut, the binding sigil still faintly visible. Daniel turned toward the kitchen, where the basement door stood ajar once again. A chill ran down his spine. He hadn't left it open. As he approached the kitchen, the air grew colder. The smell of damp earth and something metallic was stronger now, almost suffocating. He hesitated at the threshold, shining the flashlight. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the shadow. It stood near the basement door, tall and motionless, darker than the surrounding gloom. It wasn't cast by anything Daniel could see. It simply existed, a void that seemed to absorb the light. His breath hitched as the shadow shifted, moving toward him without a sound. Daniel stumbled back, the flashlight flickering wildly. His heart pounded as he turned and ran, sprinting up the stairs two at a time. He slammed the bedroom door behind him and wedged the chair under the knob once more, his chest heaving with each ragged breath. The shadow hadn't followed. Not yet. He collapsed onto the bed, clutching the journal like a talisman. The air in the room was freezing now, each breath visible as a thin plume of mist. The whispers started again, faint and distant at first, but growing louder. Daniel. It was the same voice as before, soft and almost comforting, but laden with an undercurrent of malice. It echoed through the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Daniel covered his ears, but the whispers persisted, crawling into his mind like tendrils of smoke. They spoke in fragments, disjointed phrases that made little sense. "Open the door. Let us in. You belong here." He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. The journal. There had to be something in it that could help. He flipped through the pages frantically, searching for anything that mentioned protection or banishment. Finally, he found it, a section detailing a protective ritual. The instructions were complicated, involving specific herbs, a circle of salt, and the recitation of an incantation. The Latin phrases were scrawled in his father's cramped handwriting, along with warnings about the importance of timing. The ritual must be performed at the hour of binding, midnight. Failure to complete it will result in the entity gaining full access to the physical plane. Daniel's eyes darted to the clock on the wall. It still read 3 a.m., but he knew better now. Time in this house was fluid, bending to the will of whatever haunted it. He had to act quickly. The instructions called for salt, candles, and a sprig of sage, items Daniel vaguely remembered seeing in the kitchen pantry. He forced himself to move, every step a struggle against the oppressive weight pressing down on him. The whispers grew louder as he descended the stairs, each word a needle in his mind. The kitchen was unnaturally cold. He rummaged through the pantry, finding a dusty container of salt and a bundle of dried herbs. The candles were in a drawer near the sink, their wax yellowed with age. He gathered everything and returned to the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. Daniel drew a circle of salt on the floor, placing the candles at equidistant points around its perimeter. He lit them one by one, the flames flickering in the cold air. The sage, tied into a small bundle, rested in the center of the circle. He knelt, the journal open before him, and began to read the incantation. The Latin words felt foreign on his tongue, each syllable heavy with meaning. The air in the room grew colder still, and the shadows outside the circle writhed and twisted. The whispers reached a crescendo, drowning out his voice. The door rattled violently, as if something on the other side was desperate to get in. Daniel pressed on, his voice rising above the din. Ex tenebris, nos liberate. From the darkness, deliver us. The shadows recoiled, shrinking back toward the walls. The temperature in the room began to rise, and the oppressive weight lifted slightly. But as Daniel finished the incantation, a final, chilling whisper cut through the air. This is only the beginning. The candle snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness. Daniel sat in the suffocating darkness, heart pounding, ears straining for any sound beyond the oppressive silence. The air felt thick now, each breath a laborious effort. He clutched the journal tightly, its worn leather cover slick with sweat from his trembling hands. The room was pitch black, but he didn't dare reach for the flashlight. Every flicker of light seemed to draw the attention of whatever watched him from the shadows. He closed his eyes and counted slowly under his breath, trying to calm himself. The whispers were gone, but their absence felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. A floorboard creaked just beyond the door. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He stayed perfectly still, muscles taut, as though any movement might draw the thing's attention. Another creak followed, then another, deliberate and slow. It was pacing now, moving back and forth just outside his room. The chair wedged under the knob shifted, a faint scrape against the wood. He bit down on his lip, the metallic tang of blood sharp in his mouth. His mind raced. There was no way out. The window was too high, the glass too thick to break with the few things he had. He'd have to wait it out. But wait for what? Morning? It didn't seem to matter here. Time felt like an illusion, stretched and warped beyond meaning. The pacing stopped. The silence stretched on, unnatural and thick. Then, softly, almost imperceptibly, the knob began to turn. The chair groaned as the door pushed against it. It held fast, but Daniel knew it wouldn't last forever. His eyes flicked to the journal. There had to be something else, some other protection. He flipped through the pages blindly, fingers skimming over the words. The Latin phrases blurred together, meaningless in his panic. A soft knock echoed through the room, gentle but insistent. Daniel's breath hitched. His throat felt tight, as though invisible hands were wrapping around it. He swallowed hard, forcing air into his lungs. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Daniel, let me in." It was his father's voice. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He pressed his forehead against the cold floor, shaking his head. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. His father was dead. Gone. But the voice continued, soft and pleading. "Please, son, I need you to open the door." "No," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "You're not him." A pause. Then a low, guttural chuckle. The chair scraped violently as the door rattled on its hinges. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the house, blending into a chorus of other voices, each one familiar and wrong. Daniel crawled back to the circle of salt, clutching the bundle of sage. He lit it with a trembling hand, the smoke curling in lazy spirals. The voices recoiled, hissing like steam against a hot pan. The door stilled. The air grew heavy again, pressing down on him like a weight. Daniel's head swam, and he struggled to keep his eyes open. He knew this was more than exhaustion. The house was feeding on him, draining his strength. The journal's pages fluttered as though caught in a breeze. A single page stood out, marked with a crude drawing of a door surrounded by symbols. Beneath it, a single line of text stood out in bold letters. "Find the heart." Daniel stared at it, confusion clouding his thoughts. The heart? Of the house? What did that even mean? His mind felt sluggish, like wading through thick mud. He needed to focus. The door rattled again, more violently this time, the hinges groaning under the pressure. The chair wouldn't hold much longer. He had to move. He gathered the journal and sage, stuffing them into his backpack. The salt was nearly gone, scattered across the floor, but he scraped up what little he could into a small pouch. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The window. Daniel moved toward it, prying at the frame. The paint was old and cracked, the wood brittle. He pushed harder, feeling it give slightly. The pounding on the door intensified, now a relentless assault. Splinters flew as the chair shifted, the door opening just a fraction. He shoved harder. The window creaked, the frame splintering with a sharp crack. Cold air rushed in, biting at his face. He didn't think, he just moved, throwing his backpack through first. He hauled himself up and out, landing in a heap on the overgrown grass below. The wind held around him, carrying whispers that seemed to echo from every direction. He stumbled to his feet, grabbing the backpack and running blindly into the woods. The house loomed behind him, a dark silhouette against the sky. It felt like it was watching, waiting. Branches whipped at his face as he pushed deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around him. The air was thick with fog, muffling the sounds of his footsteps. He didn't know where he was going. Just away from that thing. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. The forest felt endless, each step taking him deeper into a maze of shadows and twisted roots. His legs burned, lungs screaming for air, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Finally, he broke through into a clearing. The ground was soft beneath his feet, covered in a thick carpet of moss. In the center stood a single, ancient tree, its branches gnarled and bare. At its base, something glowed faintly, a pulsing, red light. The heart. Daniel approached cautiously, the air humming with energy. The journal had mentioned something about a tree, but the details were vague. He knelt before the glowing object, realizing it wasn't part of the tree, but something embedded in the roots. A small, blackened stone, pulsing with an inner light. He reached out, fingers brushing the surface. The moment he touched it, a surge of energy shot through him, knocking him back. The forest around him blurred, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. And then, silence. Daniel lay on the ground, staring up at the sky. The stone was gone, the tree silent and still. The air felt different now, lighter. The oppressive weight was gone. He sat up slowly, heart racing. The house still loomed in the distance, but it felt diminished. The malevolence that had surrounded it was gone, at least for now. Daniel didn't wait. He turned and walked back through the woods, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. He didn't know what he had done or what the stone truly was, but one thing was certain. This was far from over. Daniel reached the edge of the woods as the first light of dawn bathed the landscape in a pale, golden glow. His breath came in ragged gasps, each step forward feeling like a victory over the exhaustion that clung to him. The house stood in the distance, its dark silhouette framed by the rising sun. It looked almost normal now, just another forgotten relic of time. But Daniel knew better. He paused, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. The forest behind him felt different, quieter, more peaceful. The oppressive presence that had chased him through the night seemed to have retreated. For now, the journal rested heavily in his backpack, its contents a burden he wasn't sure he was ready to bear. He needed to get back to town, find help, and make sense of what had happened. But as he started down the gravel path leading away from the house, a soft rustling behind him made him freeze. Daniel turned slowly, heart hammering in his chest. The clearing was empty, the forest still. But something felt off, like the air itself was holding its breath. He took a cautious step forward, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Nothing. He shook his head, telling himself it was just paranoia. Too many sleepless nights and too many hours spent in that cursed house. He needed rest, food, and a plan. Pulling his jacket tighter around him, Daniel turned and continued down the path. The whisper came again, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Daniel. His blood ran cold. It wasn't coming from the house or the woods. It was inside his head, slithering through his thoughts like a parasite. He stumbled, gripping the sides of his head as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Come back." "No," Daniel gasped, squeezing his eyes shut. "You're gone. I stopped you." Laughter echoed in his mind, cold and mocking. "You think it's that simple? The door is open, Daniel. You can't unopen it." Panic gripped him. He fumbled for the journal, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. There had to be something, another ritual, another binding spell. But the words blurred together, incomprehensible in his fear. The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and warping like a living thing. The trees on either side leaned in, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, flickering like dying flames. Daniel stumbled forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. His legs felt like lead, his body weighed down by an invisible force. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. They called to him, pulling at his mind, his soul. He fell to his knees, gasping for air. The ground beneath him was cold and damp, the scent of earth and decay filling his nostrils. He closed his eyes, focusing on his breathing, willing the voices to stop. And then silence. Daniel opened his eyes slowly. The forest was gone. He was back in the basement of the house, the walls closing in around him. The air was thick with the scent of burnt wood and something metallic. The lantern on the workbench flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. He was paralyzed, trapped in place as the shadows around him began to shift and grind. They moved with purpose, coalescing into a single, towering figure. It had no face, just a void where its features should have been. But Daniel could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding. It reached out with one elongated hand, the fingers impossibly long and thin. They brushed against his cheek, cold as death. "You were chosen," the thing whispered. "The house demands a keeper." Daniel tried to scream, but no sound came. The figure leaned in closer, its presence suffocating. The room spun, the edges of his vision blurring as darkness closed in. Daniel woke with a start, gasping for air. He was lying in the clearing, the sun now high in the sky. The forest was quiet, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. He sat up, disoriented and aching all over. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? The journal was still in his hands, the pages open to the same drawing of the door. But now, scrawled beneath it in fresh ink, were 3 words. "It is coming." Daniel's heart sank. Whatever he had faced in the house wasn't gone. It was still out there, waiting, watching, and it wasn't finished with him yet. Daniel staggered to his feet, every muscle screaming in protest. The morning sunlight felt thin, almost sickly, as if it were struggling to pierce the veil of dread that hung over the clearing. His fingers tightened around the journal, its leather cover warm despite the chill in the air. He couldn't stay here. He needed to move, but every direction felt the same, uncertain, treacherous. The forest, now silent, felt more like a mausoleum than a sanctuary. Even the birds were gone, their absence amplifying the weight of the whisper that still echoed faintly in his mind. He swallowed hard, forcing his legs to carry him forward, back toward the gravel road that would lead him away from the house. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, the only sound accompanying him as he walked. With each step, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see that faceless shadow stalking him. But the path behind him remained empty. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something that lingered just out of sight. The road twisted and turned, and Daniel's sense of time faltered. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps it was the other way around. His thoughts spiraled as he tried to piece together everything he had read in the journal. The house, his father's warnings, the strange rituals. It all pointed to something ancient, something that had claimed his family long before he was born. The words, "the house demands a keeper," echoed in his mind, chilling him to the core. What did that mean? Was his father the previous keeper? Was that why he never returned? Why he left Daniel with nothing but fragmented memories and cryptic warnings? A sudden noise snapped Daniel from his thoughts. A rustling, faint but deliberate, coming from the trees to his left. He stopped, heart thudding painfully in his chest. The rustling grew louder, closer. Daniel clenched his fists, wishing he had something, anything, to defend himself. The bushes parted, and a figure emerged. It was a woman middle-aged, with graying hair pulled into a loose braid. She wore a heavy coat and carried a large wicker basket filled with herbs and flowers. Her eyes, sharp and alert, locked onto Daniel immediately. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and steady. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. I'm leaving. I just need to get back to town." The woman stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his face. "The woods don't let people leave so easily, especially those marked by the house." A cold dread settled in Daniel's stomach. "Marked?" She nodded, setting the basket down and folding her arms. "I've seen it before. You've been touched by something old, something that feeds on fear and pain. If you don't break its hold, it'll follow you forever." Daniel's hands trembled. "How do I stop it?" The woman's eyes softened, a flicker of pity crossing her face. "There's a ritual, but it's dangerous. And once it's begun, there's no turning back." "I don't care," Daniel said, voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. "Tell me what I need to do." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Follow me." The woman's cabin was tucked deep within the forest, nearly hidden by the dense foliage. It was small but well kept, with herbs hanging from the rafters and a fire crackling in the stone hearth. The air inside smelled of sage and something faintly sweet. Daniel felt a strange sense of calm as he stepped inside, as if the cabin itself was a refuge from the darkness outside. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor, a healer and, as she put it, a watcher of the woods. She brewed a pot of tea, setting a cup in front of Daniel as she began gathering various ingredients from shelves and drawers. "The house you came from," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. "It's more than just wood and stone. It's a vessel, a conduit for something much older." Daniel nodded slowly. "I read about the symbols. My father, he tried to protect it, or contain it." Eleanor paused, glancing at him. "Your father was the last keeper. He knew the risks, but he stayed to keep others safe. When he died, the house chose a new one." Daniel's stomach twisted. "Me?" "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "But you can reject it. That's what the ritual is for." She placed a small wooden box on the table, opening it to reveal a collection of items: a vial of black sand, a shard of obsidian, and a long, silver needle. "The ritual requires 3 things," she explained: a connection to the house, a conduit for its power, and a sacrifice. Daniel's eyes widened. "Sacrifice? Not your life," Eleanor assured him, "but something precious, a memory, a piece of your soul, something the house can't take from you willingly." He stared at the items, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "What happens if I don't do this?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "It will consume you. Slowly, at first. You'll lose time, memories. Eventually, you'll become part of the house, just like the others." Daniel swallowed hard. "But the others? Every keeper who came before. Their spirits are bound to it, trapped in an endless cycle." A chill ran down his spine. He thought of the whispers, the shadowy figure. They weren't just manifestations of fear. They were people. People like his father. "I'll do it," Daniel said, his voice resolute. Eleanor nodded. "We'll begin at dusk." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Eleanor led Daniel to a clearing surrounded by ancient stones. The air was charged with energy, and the temperature seemed to drop the moment they stepped inside the circle. Eleanor drew a symbol in the dirt, sprinkling the black sand around its edges. She placed the obsidian shard in the center, then handed Daniel the silver needle. "Prick your finger," she instructed. "Let a single drop of blood fall onto the stone." Daniel hesitated for only a moment before pressing the needle into his fingertip. The sharp sting was brief, and a bead of blood welled up. He held his hand over the obsidian, watching as the drop fell, splattering against the dark surface. The ground trembled. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the air, and the shadows around them began to writhe. Daniel felt a pull, like invisible hands grasping at him, tugging him toward the center of the circle. "Focus," Eleanor urged. "Think of the sacrifice, what you're willing to give." Daniel closed his eyes, memories flashing through his mind. His childhood, his mother's laughter, the warmth of his father's arms. The house had already taken so much. He couldn't let it take more. "I give my fear," he whispered. "You can't have it." The pull intensified, and for a moment, Daniel felt as though he were being torn apart. But then, as suddenly as it began, the sensation stopped. The air grew still, the shadows retreating. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's done." Daniel opened his eyes. The weight that had pressed on him for so long finally lifted. The house's hold was broken. For now.